Hello, my name is Chris Colvin. Welcome to #EHS 2019. I have the great honour of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Graham Brownlow, to the stage. Graham is the world-leading expert on the economy of Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, both historically and today. He is also the only economist of Northern Ireland historically and today, perhaps. It's a niche field, and Graham has published in all kinds of different places in economic history, in regional economics, and also in methodology, history of economic thought. He's published on contemporary issues surrounding tax, and he's published on the linen industry during the Industrial Revolution. And tonight he's going to be talking about some more business history aspects to his work surrounding, well, as the title suggests, the history of DeLorean, which he will go into. Graham is also, in addition to his academic expertise, has an encyclopedic knowledge of everything to do with all professional sports, except tennis, which he doesn't think is a sport. Right, so, yeah. He is also regularly interviewed on national and local television and radio on a whole host of diverse things, including the economics of Game of Thrones. So he was on TV for that. And he also likes not B movies, C movies, or D movies, like really trashy horror movies. So that's what Graham does in his free time, besides from his obsession with the DeLorean Motor Company. So without further ado, I welcome Graham to the stage.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for that Colvin-esque introduction. It's a mixed blessing. Anyway, okay, so set the expectations low and you'll only exceed them. Theresa May, 2019. Anyway, okay, so what I'm going to talk about is this is the Friday night bit, which is traditionally about a local flavour. So I'm going to cover the local flavour of DeLorean and how it links to wider issues of the Northern Ireland economy and economic history and how we got to where we are. So some quotes before we get into it. The show, as it were. The first quote is taken from a very dreary report on the Northern Ireland economy from 1970. Northern Ireland may be caught in a vicious circle of political instability and industrial decline. Upbeat, 1970 Belfast. Then we have one of the quotes of John DeLorean. I'm starting to recognise that God stuck me here to be part of the solution to the crisis in Northern Ireland. Modesty was not one of his fortes, and nor was a profitable car company, but that comes later in the story. Okay? And then last and not least, overheard by Lord Bruce Garden, gee, do they let those little guys out in there? And that's him talking about the civil servants he was negotiating with. So, lots of bargaining contracts later on in the story. So what am I going to do in the next hour? So I'm going to talk after the introduction about the cultural resonance of DeLorean, and we will, of course, have Back to the Future, but I'm going to leave that towards the end. I'm going to talk about the other troubles, because I'm going to point out how the troubles interacted with the economic troubles of Northern Ireland that predated the political violence of the 60s to the 90s. I'm going to talk a bit about DeLorean operating in Dunmurry, West Belfast, Twinbrook, etc. And then I'm going to go a wee bit nerdy at the end with a bit of micro-type economics. I'm going to talk a bit about demand, supply and contracts and the extent to which this was a stainless steel lemon. and then we'll have some conclusions. So, okay, so introduction. There we have the man himself sitting on one of his aforementioned eponymous vehicles. What am I going to talk a bit about? Well, as I said, this is a local flavour. And the irony, of course, that I'm talking about DeLorean, then tomorrow night we go to the Titanic. And there is, of course, George Best's hotel and airport. We do like to celebrate failure. The danger is, academically, as you become what you study. Given I'm studying failure, oh dear. Anyway, some people are calling this a career. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk a bit about in the story is not necessarily the popular view. I'm going to talk a little bit about the interaction between Whitehall and Stormont, in particular the Treasury, because I'm going to say a lot about what happens before DeLorean in 78 comes to Belfast. A lot of it's to do with the Treasury, because I think one of the stories that's not told and is basically the relationship of the Treasury to Northern Ireland. I think everybody talks about the Home Office, etc., for obvious reasons. But I think there's a story about the Treasury and its relationship to this part of the world. And we're going to see there's a lot about government infighting. Okay, there's an awful lot about government infighting. How not to do things. Okay. So before I get dissed by all the DeLorean owners of the world, I put in a public, which I do frequently. My favourite one, as I've said to other people, is on some of the forums I get described as so-called professor. My critics were less kind. The project has a number of achievements. Okay. Firstly, we have the fact that it created jobs in an area which had approximately an estimated 80% unemployment rate. 80%. That's not a typo. And, you know, they built a car factory starting on October 2nd, 78. To move from a cow pasture to production for 18 months was a promise that was kept. That's an achievement. People from Ford, etc., said it wasn't possible. Likewise, another achievement was that absenteeism was 1.2%, which for Northern Ireland in 1970s was a hell of an achievement. As they used to say about Harn and Wolff, how many people work at Harn and Wolff? About a quarter. And then the last and not least, the achievement is the design itself. And again, I put the numbers down. There's roughly an estimate 6,500 on the road. There's some debate about how many were actually built in terms of how you define whether the cars got onto the forecourt or were built. There's a difference in the number. So it's about 9,200 maybe were built. I think maybe a lower number for how many got onto the forecourts, but we'll come on to that later on, that difference. Okay, so DeLorean in the popular imagination. So Back to the Future will appear, but not quite now. Okay, so what can we say? Well, there's a number of things. I didn't put on Neon, Super Furry Animals side project, which is a concept album by John DeLorean. I just included 3. Glenn Patterson, his novel Gull. And then, you know, John DeLorean movie screenplays have been knocking around for years, rather like Back to the Future screenplay knocked around Hollywood for years. And then you wait for all this time, and then Hollywood, you end up with 2 movies coming out about John DeLorean at once, which is often the way in Hollywood. So we have, in the case of Gull, Glenn Patterson's novel, he says of it, I made this all up, apart from the things you couldn't. And as we'll see, the cast of characters, I suspect, have never been heard of before at a plenary lecture of the Economic History Society, and will never be heard of again, I wager. And then we have Driven, the screenplay by Colin Bateman, the local novelist, most famous for Divorcing Jack and various other crime novels, Dan Starkey novels. His movie screenplay, which was, I think, premiered in the Venice Film Festival last year, ironically was filmed in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, of course, lost out to Belfast to get production of the DeLorean. And it's set in the sort of the drug bust at the end, the cocaine bit at the end. And then last not least, Framing John DeLorean, in which Alec Baldwin plays John DeLorean, but it's a documentary as well as a straight film. It's lots of talking heads. Okay. So, again, there's a whole genre of people who worked for John DeLorean and DeLorean himself, all inverted commas, trying to set the record straight. DeLorean's own biography, it's a tough read. And as they used to say at the end of better movies, I don't just watch bad movies. I generally do watch movies with monsters in them, but if they're movies, proper movies, at the end of the movies they say any resemblance to persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Well, any resemblance to historical fact in his biography is purely coincidental. There's very, 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 very little. All sorts of fanciful stuff. Then we have William Haddad, who's an interesting character. He was one of his vice president of planning. William Haddad had been a political journalist and had been assistant to Robert Kennedy. And he had edited a book on African American economic development in which DeLorean had a chapter, which was predictably ghosted. He got a job in Belfast, actually in New York, I think, largely. They had a fallout, and he wrote The Hard Driving, which is an entertaining book with all sorts of weird stuff about DeLorean's political ambitions, which of more perhaps later. It's all a little bit mind-bending, but there's a lot of score settling in it. We have Nick Sutton, who was a senior manager. This is quite a good book in many ways. There's some link between the stuff in terms of the archive, although he doesn't use archival material. But it's very much a conspiracy theory view. There's a conspiracy theory view of DeLorean in which everything was hunky-dory, and if it wasn't for the pesky General Motors, Chrysler, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, conspiracy, it would have all gone hunky-dory. I'm not sure that he quite understands the idea of a to-do list. That in 1981, I'm sure Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had other things in their mind than destroying John DeLorean. But anyway, this book, it's a good book, but it's a conspiracy theory. And then last not least, Barry Wills' book, which has got some very interesting things about the organization of John DeLorean's factory, but does suffer because, again, it would have you believe that it's literally Margaret Thatcher not listening at one meeting over £80,000 that leads to its closure. This is, well, nonsense, essentially. I mean, we'll talk about sunk costs, etc. There's a whole range of this. Okay, so that's very much sort of the literature. Okay, so here's a cast of characters, which again, some may have appeared in the Economic History Society plenary, but I'm sure spot the one who's probably least likely to have appeared in the plenary lecture of the Economic History Society. If I ask the students, they'd still be waiting. Okay, so we have Alec Cairncross going from our left. Alec Cairncross is going to be a big part of this story because of his report in 1971 that leads to the funding of DeLorean. We have Colin Chapman, who was boss of Lotus, and he's involved in what's called the GPD scandal, which I could do a paper in its own right easily about GPD scandal. Essentially, this is the criminal bit of the DeLorean where money goes a walkabouts into Swiss accounts. In a Father Ted-esque, it was resting in the account style. And then we have Sir Kenneth Cork, receiver, who has little doubt about all sorts of these shenanigans, and we'll talk a bit about later on. And last but not least, Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. Was involved in this story because he invested $500,000 in the DeLorean Research Partnership. Johnny Carson also invested $100,000. George Lucas passed. There's a whole range of celebrities who did invest and those who passed. Sammy Davis Jr., as you can see, very proud with his DeLorean. It has a sad ending. when the business gets into trouble, Sammy discovered his gift was not a gift and it was towed away. So Sammy Davis Jr. appears in this story. Okay, so there's a lot of attempts, and I haven't seen the movies yet, but you can tell the screenplay from the journalistic accounts of DeLorean, in which the psychology of DeLorean and his supposed love for the high life is seen as an explanation. But, there's a lot more going on, as we'll see when I talk about the archives, which we'll talk about later on. Anyway, so Northern Ireland's other troubles, okay? So, again, I don't want to go into too much detail. It's a Friday night, and you don't want me doing heavy duty the Northern Ireland economic history. Suffice to say, this is a table that gives us a gap of around about 20% for the last 3 decades or so between income per head in Northern Ireland relative to GB. And you'll see in the early period, say from 1926, sorry, I think I better move out here. Okay, so we have our story from data, I just took various years, 1926, 47, 60, 73. There is convergence. Notice the convergence actually occurs during the period of so-called direct rule after 1972 and the Troubles. There's a lot going on, okay? What we're going to say is there's a lot going on here, a lot of complicated processes. But perhaps the best way to start it is the original report on the Northern Ireland economy, official report, Iles and Cuthbert, 1957, their economic survey. It's a very important report, not a hugely entertaining read, but it's the first official report. Notice it's 1957, more than 3 decades after Northern Ireland's established. And as they say in that report, they say, in some respects, the most interesting question is why industrial growth has not been greater, but why it has been as great as it has. Now, the report itself is very thorough, very diligent, but as an economic historian, what I actually find more interesting and more important is the fact that it sat on the shelf for 2 years. So it was commissioned by the Northern Ireland government, the report was delivered in 1955 to the Stormont government, and it sat on the shelf for 2 years. And then when it finally was taken off the shelf, for all sorts of complicated reasons I'm not going to go into, they then issued a document to every unionist MP at Stormont, a 22-page document disowning their own report. And spin didn't begin with Tony Blair, it began a long time before Blair, spinning how the report should be interpreted and giving a story about transport costs and what's called peripherality, that Northern Ireland's problem was its remoteness from GB. But Iles and Cuthbert, if you read the report carefully, they talk about things like what they call a term they use, attitudes of restriction. They talk about absence of competition in Northern Ireland. They don't say the reasons, but they just point out some observations about why some parts of the Northern Ireland economy lacked competition. And it's not due to geography, okay? Again, if we go back again to the next slide, just to reiterate about GDP per capita, we can see that Northern Ireland, from about 1950 well into 2000, was clearly the worst performing in terms of income per head. I could go through all the data on unemployment, employment rates, activity, etc. But it's the Friday night show, so I'm not going to go through all that kind of detail. It's going to hold back what I really want to go into, to think about the story, the environment in which DeLorean comes into being. So there's a range of these official reports, all very diligent. And the point that Nick Crafts initially made in 95, and I'd followed up in a paper, an economic history review, is the fact that Northern Ireland missed out in the golden age. Okay? Now, Nick surmised that there was something fishy and looked a lot like rent-seeking. And I did some archival digging and found a lot of evidence for rent-seeking. And I think that's part of the story that goes on in Northern Ireland. Obviously, there's the stories about deglobalization, discrimination, etc. We could talk a bit about. But perhaps more important, particularly for the time we're in, is the story about competition that I mentioned earlier on, Isles and Cuthbert. Now, there are many ways you can interpret British economic history. And we'll be hearing some over these next few days. But one interpretation about, if we talk about Brentry, British entry, is that you could you could tell a story in which there's a tug of war in the British economy between, on the one hand, those things that promote efficiency, competition, and those things that are holding it back, bad industrial relations, management, etc., etc. And that what British entry into the EEC does, it raises the level of competition in the economy. Now, Northern Ireland had less competition than the rest of the United Kingdom. I won't go into all the details. But it is true that it was very much a place apart. And there's a lot of current discussion about what's, regulatory divergence. We're hearing this all the time, this phrase, regulatory divergence. But when I go into the archive and look at Northern Ireland not leaving the EU, but going into the common market or whatever, I see that the only reason that there wasn't regulatory divergence to begin with was because of the EEC. The United Kingdom was not a common labour market. Okay? You did not have freedom to work in Northern Ireland, despite the fact you could be from the rest of the United Kingdom. Under the Safeguarding of Employment Act, Northern Ireland Act 1947, it was the Ministry of Labour in Northern Ireland that had the final say, and hence could restrict your ability to work in Northern Ireland, even if you were from the rest of the UK. There are indeed 3 files that I have on my shelf, photocopied from the National Archive at Kew, which go into extreme detail in this phenomenon. So this is kind of one of these sorts of aspects of the story which we should think a wee bit about in terms of its implications for thinking about competition in the economy and how it all fits together. Okay, so I went a bit heavy there, and again, I want to talk a bit, I know it's a Friday night, I don't really want to do too much of that stuff. What I want to do is, again, go back to thinking about Northern Ireland before DeLorean and what's going on in the Northern Ireland economy and why it ends up, the economy looks the way it does, and why politics intrudes and how it intrudes. And again, I'm going to invoke something that I presume has not appeared in the Economic History Society conference plenary lecture ever before. There we go. Okay. The attention is not so much on Adam West or Bruce Ward. It's this guy here, Cyril Lord. He of carpets fame. Those of you who would admit to watching Homes Under the Hammer will have seen lots of old Cyril Lord carpets, and some of you will remember Luxury You Can Afford and go into YouTube and watch these things. Now, why Cyril Lord? What has Cyril Lord got to do with this story? Well, Cyril Lord is the biggest corporate failure in Northern Ireland's history until DeLorean. Okay? Cyril Lord is a Lancashire textile guy brought in during the Second World War to improve efficiency of industry in Northern Ireland. One of the stories about Northern Ireland's economic history is during the Second World War, basically, the British establishment found out the hard way that a lot of Northern Irish industry was not nearly as efficient as it could have been. Okay? And so someone like Harold Wilson, a young Harold Wilson as Minister of Supply, part of the whole animus he had to unionists the rest of his life was the fact that when he went in and bossed them around, they were good Ulstermen and said thanks but no thanks, or worse to that effect. Cyril Lord was one of the bright young things brought into Northern Ireland, and he decided that actually this was the place he wanted to do business. He wanted to do business in Northern Ireland. Why? Because Northern Ireland had devolved its industrial policy separate from the rest of the United Kingdom. It had a much more generous set of subsidies. It had free advanced factories. I won't go through all the rules and regs. Suffice to say that he sets the company up in 1945, but he doesn't start production in Northern Ireland until the mid-1950s. Okay? So what we're really looking at is that this business that's set up in Northern Ireland, in particular Donaghadee, is producing lots of carpets for the market. Now, there's all sorts of problems with the business model that I won't go into lots of detail on. And suffice to say, what happens is eventually he runs out of road. The business is taken out of his hands in 1968, and Viella takes on the factories. I think Cyril Lord's important as a cautionary tale because it tells us about the overlap that I think is at root of the rent-seeking problem in Northern Ireland in this period, of the overlap between a business and political elite. Okay? I think this is at the nub of a lot of the problems. You know, if you're thinking of a Schumpeter story of creative destruction, you have to allow the old unproductive to be replaced by the new. Once you have business overlapping with the political elite, there's vested interests that block that process. Okay? And there's an opportunity cost in that story. So you're left with a story in which Cyril Lord, you know, having a soirees in Donaghadee. If you've ever been to Donaghadee, the idea that David Frost, Jack Hawkins, Gracie Fields, etc., Alan Wicker were promenading around Donaghadee is quite mind-bending, but you know, the 60s. And I'm not sure there's even any drugs involved. So, but you know, it's kind of mind-bending. But that's where we were at. In terms of, oh yes, I should say about why he's on Batman. Okay, he was selling carpets in Los Angeles, on adverts, Los Angeles. And he ran into the producer of Batman. And Cyril Lord was a great self-promoter and said, I really would like to be in your TV show. And the producer of Batman said, well, generally the cameos are done by people like Edward G. Robinson, etc., etc. People you might have heard of, not a guy who makes carpets in Donaghadee, wherever that is. That's how Cyril Lord, and stories vary. The nub of it is that the producer of Batman got a carpet, and Cyril Lord got, if you watch on YouTube, one of the worst line readings of all time, the King Carpet of Europe. It's Carpet King of Europe, sorry. Yeah, it's quite strange. It really is. Anyway, so I don't want to dwell a lot on the violence and obviously bring the mood down, but the point is the timing of violence and the level of violence in Northern Ireland is not a coincidence to the story of the economic policy in Northern Ireland changing in a way that brings in John DeLorean. Essentially, and again, I should come out at this point. Okay, so I think the thing to note is really the violence, and this is the number of deaths, I could use any measure of violence, it really spikes up in 1971, and in particular after the introduction of internment without trial in August 1971. Now, what is interesting in terms of the economy and the Treasury's relationship to Northern Ireland is that the index of industrial production for Northern Ireland continues to rise well after the violence has started to kick in. So there's a real issue of the Treasury saying to the officials in Belfast, what are you complaining about in terms of the economy? The index production is growing, nothing to see here. I could go through all sorts of files in this regard. It's really only once internment without trial kicks in and the violence surges, investment really dries up. And that creates the story of Alec Cairncross that I'll come to later on. I could go through any number of files. This is just one from 1976, a Treasury file. And really, it just opens by saying there's an economic dimension to the Northern Ireland problem. If we could flood the north with enough factories and jobs to go round, both sections in the community, blah, 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 tensions would be greatly reduced. There's a lot of stuff in that genre. And you go through the files in Kew or Belfast, it's full of this. I've got boxes and boxes of this sort of discussion. Where does it arise? And why is there a difference in the views of officials in, say, the Treasury in London, the Northern Ireland Office in London, the Department of Industry in London, and the Northern Irish Civil Service? Because that is a story about shaping the environment in which John DeLorean comes in. Okay? There's a whole range of reports. The Touche-Ross report of 1970-71 is a survey of factories, and it tends to downplay the impact of violence in the economy. This is pre-internment. Okay? This is at the time when the Treasury is still saying to the civil service, there's nothing to see here. And the people in Belfast saying, well, there is something to see here. We're in Belfast. You're in the Treasury. It's really only what was called the Development Programme of 1970-75, which the Northern Ireland government is running. But the projections just start evaporating after the introduction of internment. At that point, the Treasury recognises there's a problem. And at that point, they deliberately bring Alec Cairncross in to do the Cairncross report. And the Cairncross report is really kind of interesting. It's a very short report. I think it's like 17 pages long. But what it identifies is a story of what we would call cumulative causation or positive feedback, whatever terminology you want. And essentially, what Cairncross says is unemployment is a recruiting sergeant for the IRA in Cairncross's analysis. And this is, essentially what the British Army is saying. Because the British Army, are the ones saying this is a lone haul. There will be no quick military victory. We could be here years and years and years, decades. And the British Army are saying, actually, you need to pump money into Northern Ireland quite quickly. Thank you very much, because this situation could get a lot worse. And what Cairncross says is actually, if you think, as the evidence suggests, that unemployment is a recruiting sergeant for the IRA and loyalism, and if you see violence reducing investment, that reduction in investment is going to raise unemployment. And that increase in unemployment, of course, is going to increase the recruitment to the IRA, which is going to increase violence, which is going to increase the problem of investment, and it's all going to feed back again a loop over and over again. And you're going to end up with a downward spiral. So, Cairncross, if you think of his analysis, it's sort of like a Heimlich maneuver. It's sort of how the hell do we stop this situation arising? And his argument is you've got to throw some government money into the system. You've got to stop the collapse of investment, because the collapse of investment is driving up the unemployment, and that's the recruiting sergeant. What's also very notable, archivally, is the tone of the actual final report says lots of warm words about management and trade unions, but privately, Cairncross is very critical of management and trade unions in Northern Ireland. But you need the management and trade unions in Northern Ireland on your side to fight sort of sectarianism. So for political reasons, you can't turn around and say, actually, you guys, after years and years and years of weak competition, you make the rest of the UK's bad management unions, you make them look good, and that takes some doing. That's what Cairncross is saying. So Cairncross is saying, we've got to put money in. And he proposes what's called the Northern Ireland Finance Corporation, the NIFC. And it only starts with £50 million. Now, given the scale of the funding, this is for all firms in Northern Ireland, a fund of £50 million for all the firms. Given that the first tranche of DeLorean money is about £53 million, it tells you the scale of DeLorean's support relative to other industries, firms in Northern Ireland. Oh, please not. No, I'm not. Please not. Tell me no. Okay. I hope not. Okay. Okay. Okay, so where was I when I was not being locked out? The DeLorean Owners Associations obviously have control of my computer. Okay. Okay, so what's going on? Well, there's an idea of what's called flying swans. In other words, the idea is you want to get some business in that acts as an exemplar of best practice that will attract other firms in. But that's not really why the reorganisation of industrial policy that facilitates John DeLorean comes in. So what happens, 1974, the Ulster workers strike, there's massive infighting, Northern Ireland Finance Corporation goes rogue and does its own thing, and people say, no, we need to wind you up. And yeah. Okay, so now we kick in with John DeLorean. Tell all sorts of story about his maverick mogul, youngest general manager at Pontiac, etc., etc. Now, he leaves under murky circumstances. And it's true that the British government and Northern Irish officials were quite aware of his murky circumstances because the files in the archive are full of cuttings. Okay? They weren't unaware. Also, the British government made discreet phone calls to General Motors. What they hadn't counted on was, under the term of his departure, there was a non-aggression pact. He wouldn't say anything rude about them, they wouldn't say anything rude about him. So they weren't entirely truthful, shall we say, about the circumstances of his departure. And we'll leave it at there. Okay. So there's other parts where he tries to get money. There's the brick, one of the reasons why he doesn't get money is the experience of here, the Bricklin. Bricklin is sort of a proto-DeLorean. It's sort of in 1974. It's a factory produced in New Brunswick under financial support of the Canadian government. But it collapses with 3,000 cars recalled. Allstate also look at DeLorean, but stories differ. One story says that he's promoted as a safety car, and they have a look at the crash test footage and decide it's not that safe. That's one story. Another story is that he promised to deliver them 2 safety cars and never did. Either way, Allstate did not invest. There we have a quote by David Healy, the Wall Street, says, people ask my advice about Mr. DeLorean's venture. Yeah. Yeah. You can see what's coming, can't you? Anyway, so now he comes to Dunmurry, despite a lot of this sort of stuff. And really, what's true in the story, when you delve into the archive, it's civil servants, particularly in Belfast, that are key to promoting this project. So George Quigley, the senior figure, says, he actually uses the term in the memo, he talks about the star quality of John DeLorean. He says, having looked the risk squarely in the face, the issue is simply whether the potential prize justifies the measure of risk. My view would be the risk is justified. Again, you have an extreme set of viewpoints. The Treasury from day one don't like the idea of the project. At the other extreme, the Northern Ireland Civil Service, the NIO in London, do love the project. And then we have the Department of Industry in the middle, kind of neutral. It's not really the story of the politicians. It's the civil servants under direct rule that are calling the shots. Again, there's lots of bureaucratic infighting. So, DeLorean between 74 and 78 has only raised $5 million for the project, but only within 46 days, so it's 46 days from the initial introduction of John DeLorean to the Northern Ireland Development Agency to signing the master agreement, the contract. It's rushed. There isn't a lot of due diligence. It's also the case, what was DeLorean looking for? Well, he was looking for a bundle And what was his bundle? His bundle was as much subsidy as he could get and as little oversight as he could get. Puerto Rico, that thought they were going to do the deal, were offering half as much money. And as we'll see later on, the contract they were offering was a lot more onerous in terms of oversight. And the IDA, down south, the Industrial Development Agency, they were offering a third. And they also had a lot more strings attached. So desperation, here he is during the start. Again, one of the stories that you hear often in documentaries about DeLorean, of which there are many, is the standard story about the workforce being cross-community. And that's true up to a point. And certainly it was one of good relations. There's no real evidence of sectarianism. One of the innovations, which says a lot about Northern Ireland in 1978, was that there was no flags or emblems allowed within the factory. This was a big deal, because people were used to being allowed to parade all sorts of weird symbols, inappropriate symbols, shall we say, in factories. The DeLorean didn't allow this to happen. This is all very true, but it's very clear, looking at the archive, that whereas the shipyard was very much seen as representation of Ulster Protestantism and as an overwhelmingly Protestant East Belfast workforce, within Whitehall, it was the fact that this was a West Belfast, verging on to Twinbrook estate, predominantly nationalist Catholic workforce. And that's something, as we'll see later on, that is key to the story. Now, it's at this point I do have some numbers I'll throw in, because I want to tell a little archival story about detective work, okay? Because I had to put together these numbers because an awful lot of stuff got shredded. And so I had to go through a lot of different sources to trace out the actual production as opposed to the targeted production, okay? So what we have here is very low tech, okay? So this is the actual production, the cumulative total from 1981, which, as you see, by the end of 1981, a wee bit over 6,000 cars were built. Of course, the projected targeted production was about twice that. Of course, the gap's widening, okay? The gap's widening. So, so in terms of production, not as nearly as many cars were being produced as should have been produced, okay? And in terms of sales, I should say, sales, there's only 3,000 sold during the duration of the business, okay? So even while they're massively under hitting the production targets at Dunmurry, they're only selling half of that number. So this is interesting for what we're going to see later on, okay? So they're not matching their production targets for all sorts of supply-side problems I won't dwell on, because I've only got about 15 minutes left. But what about on the employment side? Okay, what about on the employment side? Okay, so I've put this as a table, because by putting it as a table, I'll show you what I spotted that made me think about what was going on. Okay, so this is, again, the quarter, and this is the number of workers that were actually employed in Dunmurry against the projected numbers, okay? Because you often hear the story, 2,500 people lost their jobs. That's true at the time of closure. But for the most of the life of DeLorean, there was nowhere near 2,500 employees. So notice that as late as 1980, third quarter, there were supposed to be 1,200 workers or so, and there was only 265 actually employed, okay? If we go through here, right up, third quarter 1981, supposed to be 1,800 employed, now there's 1,600. Right at the end, all of a sudden, 2,500 employed, and then it goes badly wrong. Now, sales are not working out during 1981. Production targets are not being met. Yet, there's a hiring binge. Okay, let's think about that. This is where my lowbrow tastes come in, because I'm reminded of nothing so much as Inspector Columbo. And the point in every episode of Columbo where he says, and just one more thing. Because what we're telling in this story is you're not producing as many cars as you should be producing. You're not selling half of the cars that you're producing, which is under the target. And yet right at the end, when the news is getting worse and worse, suddenly you start hiring like Billy-O, and you end up with massive amount of employment. This is all rather curious, I think is the term. Okay, so how do I think about this archivally? Well, let's think about incentives. Okay, so let's use a wee bit of not very sophisticated, because I don't do very sophisticated, you might have noticed, economics to think about the incentives. Okay. DeLorean very early in the story knew that staffing levels way exceeded the demand for the car. Okay? And even Sutton, in his conspiracy theory account, he recognises that people are getting hired without any need. And he also notes all the supply side problems. So what's really going on? Well, there's a number of things going on. One is DeLorean's autocracy. He just makes up decisions, as we'll see, unilaterally, without any consultation. Another thing, as we'll see, is the actual contract is really strange. And it's the contract that I think explains a lot what's going on. Okay? But let's before we get into the contract, let's do one sort of last detour into another strange episode in the history of DeLorean, the gold DeLoreans. Okay? The gold DeLoreans. If you thought DeLorean stainless steel was crazy, you ain't seen gold DeLoreans. John DeLorean had unilaterally talked with the American Express Christmas mail order catalogue, which was at the time the biggest selling catalogue. And as a promotion, he decided that it would be a good idea if they would produce in the factory 100 24-carat plated gold DeLoreans to be sold at $85,000. Now, you or I might suggest, given that you're not selling stainless steel cars at initially $12,000, actually ends up in $25,000, that it's a bit optimistic. So they set aside part of the factory and have all sorts of incredible security arrangements where they're not allowed any sort of jewellery because they're fearful of scratching the gold carat. As things transpired, a grand total of 2 gold DeLoreans were ordered. There are 3 in the world. The third is an imposter. It's one that was built by a collector using gold. But the original 2 still exist. But I think this is indicative of some of the weird business decision making, if we can call it that. Again, I don't want to go into all the rigmarole of all the technical features, but the point is that they end up with a compromise in terms of the design of the car. It's not what was originally supposed to be, a safety car built to the highest spec. What they end up doing is buying in lots of parts. And there's also an issue about the inexperienced workforce. There's quality issues. And there's a rush to the market. Again, why the impatience? Well, the impatience, as well as a lot of the other problems, and this is where we come back to the economic history, is to look at the archival evidence and to look at applying a little bit of simple price theory. And that's, I think, not to look at the faults of the car itself, but to look at the faults of the original contract from 1978, under which DeLorean came to Northern Ireland. The first fault is what's called an additional monies provision. What it literally says is additional assistance. So the original lump is 53 million quid. And then there's additional monies provision that says if there are factors beyond control of DeLorean motor cars. This was supposed to be an interest rate, exchange rate provision because of all the monetary instability, currency instability, economic instability. That's what it was supposed to be. But it was framed really cack-handedly, vaguely, as things beyond their control. This is Belfast 1978 we're talking about. There are plenty of things beyond control. My learned friends could very easily point to this, okay? So there's a lot of letters going, they have us over a barrel, or words to that effect, which is a phrase that John DeLorean uses to analysts. And it's purely a legal term. The contract is written in that regard so vaguely as to be not true. Second error is really that there was a focus on employment. Okay? DeLorean is given until 5th year to hire 2,000 workers. He's given 5 years to hire 2,000 workers. What happens if he doesn't hire 2,000 workers by 1986? Any breach may or shall entitle the Department of Commerce, Northern Ireland, to require the company to repay all or such part of financial assistance. Well, there we go. This is a trolley dash. You know, you've set the stopwatch and you said, take what you can by 5 years. There's a skin in the game problem. I mentioned Puerto Rico. If I look at the Puerto Rican contract that was on the table, they were offering less subsidy, around about half. But more importantly, Puerto Rico said they would only give him funding if he himself could put down $25 million himself. He didn't have near $25 million. He had $5 million in a good day. And so by 1982, the actual limited company, we end up with 73% of the shares owned privately, backed by just over $500,000 private money. That's all that went in. And yet the taxpayer, who put in, say, 17.7 million in terms of just the investment, they're left with the remainder. There's an asymmetry. Then we have another triumph, I use the word loosely, of contract in which all the physical assets were government property until product launch. So there was no collateral. So what DeLorean could keep coming back and saying, I have no collateral. I can't get any loans from anybody but you. Oh dear, you're going to have to give me more money. And that's what he did. So there's a £14 million loan, inverted comma, based on this. And DeLorean, being DeLorean, he then has a hissy fit and tries to turn that loan, which was never going to be repaid, into an even softer grant. Again, I mentioned earlier on, this is a letter taken from Humphrey Atkins, who was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, to Sir Keith Joseph. And again, the crude sort of sectarian idea, I guess, is essentially that it's unemployment 14.5%, double the rate in Great Britain, even higher in depressed Catholic areas like West Belfast. And then the contrast with Hartnell Wolff. Again, it's a very crude argument. The Protestants have a terrible money loser in East Belfast. Let's give the Catholics a terrible money loser in West Belfast. It's literally, that's the sort of thinking going on. I use the word thinking very loosely. Mind you, compared to what we got today. Anyway. So, McKinsey's, I haven't talked about, okay? To keep the story as easy as possible. McKinsey's, of course, are babysitting this business the whole time. Archivally, their documents don't survive, but summaries of their documents do survive. And you can read their pessimism coming more and more to the fore. So by the time the car makes its debut in February 1981, the UK government has already lost faith. And as early as June 1980, in other words, before the first cars roll off the line and goes onto the market, the Treasury is already saying, really, we should close the gates, sunk costs and all that. And the only reason why the money keeps flowing is really legal opinion. The contract is just so badly put together, the British government keeps doing that. Now, one of the ironies is DeLorean keeps threatening to sue for breach of contract. Okay? Now, he's breaching contract left, right, and centre. Why don't the British government do anything about this? Why? Because of the image. The great fanfare, this is the flying swan, this is the first thing that we bring into Northern Ireland, and all the other things will flow. But if they ended up having to go to court and fighting over this, the negative publicity would damage them. So they decide not to contest these things. Just keep giving them the money and hope something turns up. Well, what does turn up? Well, what turns up is, of course, a story about demand and supply. Now, the usual story, and I think it's true in terms of demand, is there's a terrible winter in the United States, 81, 82, and there's a recession, and demand for cars goes down. But I think there's something more profound that I've written about as well. Cars are ultimately based upon things like warranties and certainty. Okay? So when you have a business where day after day, people who want to buy cars potentially are seeing news that this business is in trouble, people thinking about after sales, etc., are less inclined to buy the car. And so demand is going to fall off, irrespective of the state of the business cycle. In other words, there's a microeconomic type story going on. And true enough, you can trace that out, and I do that in the paper, 2016 paper in way more detail. So workers are laid off, and Sir Kenneth Cork, I mentioned earlier on, is brought in as a government receiver, and he says there are investors needed by May 31st, 1982. At this point, I could talk a bit about a plan to have DeLorean without DeLorean. This is the story Barry Wills tells a story about that's Margaret Thatcher's fault. This is never a credible story, really. Workers are laid off, there's no new investment, and then there's a worker sit-in, and then there's the whole entrapment of cocaine, FBI sting. That's the first trial. And then there's a second trial about GPD, which collapses because essentially the jury and the judge don't seem to understand about how to come to a decision. And the judge seems to misinform the jury, and the jury then find him not guilty, and then the judge realizes, actually, I misinformed the jury, but these things happen. And what happens, the GPD trial, Fred Bushell, who was Colin Chapman's sort of second command, he gets punished for it, gets sent down. And the judge at the trial says that John DeLorean, if he was put before the court, he would get 10 years. It's an interesting question why there was no attempt ever to extradite John DeLorean. I suspect the reason is they were terrified of what would happen in terms of publicity. And I think there was a lot of people, politicians of both being political parties and senior civil servants and all, who would look very, very silly. Not that DeLorean would tell the truth necessarily, but he could certainly make people look rather embarrassing. So all this ends up with this story of an outfit called Consolidated International. They buy the surplus stock. Notice the price, original list price. If you're wondering about the stainless steel lemon, here we go. This is one of the reasons why there's a difference in the numbers people have a difference of how many numbers of how many cars are built, because some of those cars never are sold as cars. They're sold broken up in terms of parts. because that's what Consolidated International's business model was. So notice the price going down, sticker price going down. And that's sort of the nearly, not quite the unhappy ending. No, not quite the unhappy ending, okay? I mentioned earlier on Back to the Future, haven't mentioned it really, but I will end with Back to the Future because the story of Back to the Future, the story about Back to the Future, rather like the screenplays of John DeLorean, as I mentioned earlier on, is this was a screenplay that had been knocking around Hollywood for years and years and years before it got made. In the original screenplay, it wasn't a DeLorean. In the original screenplay, there's a variety of versions of screenplay, but a lead-lined fridge was one of the original plans for the time machine. People thought, perhaps wisely, that lead-lined fridges might attract children to hide in fridges, and that perhaps that this might not be the best Hollywood could offer. So they thought, well, come up with an alternative. And as is often the case in Hollywood, stories differ of why the DeLorean was chosen. In one version, it's one of the screenwriters is watching one of the trials, I think it's the cocaine trial, the entrapment trial, and thinks about how notorious John DeLorean is, and thinks, oh, that's a nice car to go with as a time machine. That's one version of the story. The one I prefer to think about as accurate is the story that they're watching a 1950s B-movie. You can see the attraction to me. I think it's the day that the world stood still. The Earth stood still. It might be Earth v. Flying Saucer. The reason being that in both those movies, the spaceship comes down and there's a very strange little gull door that opens. The aliens come out. And the issue that was identified by Bob Zemeckis, he's supposed to have said that the DeLorean car, when you look at it, it's a 1950s idea of what the 1980s should look like, which of course is what that movie is about, moving between the 1950s and the 1980s. So as a byproduct of all this story and the highways and byways of Alec Cairncross, soft budget constraints, Sammy Davis Jr., on all the other highways and byways of this story, this little part of planet Earth left its imprint in Hollywood. So we have DeLorean tonight, and tomorrow night we're eating dinner in Titanic, and it's not all failure, you know. But yeah, I think that's probably the best, most upbeat ending I can give you, so I'll stop there. That's the best I can do. Thank you.